petition campaign to place the measure on the ballot for March 10th, 1964, for the March 10th, 1964 citywide election. In other words, they said that the people of Seattle ought to vote on this ordinance, and they ought to vote on whether or not there should be open housing in the city. A number of homeowners in the city feared the property values would decline with open housing. And their views were going to be expressed by Philip Bailey in an editorial in the Argus on March 6, 1964. I'll let you read the editorial. In March of 1964, Seattle voters rejected the open housing ordinance by a huge margin, 112,000 to 53,000. In other words, Seattle, even liberal Seattle, said publicly that it was opposed to open housing. In the aftermath of the defeat, Seattle's civil rights leaders vowed that they would continue their campaign. They were openly defiant in the face of that vote. They said that they would initiate a campaign of civil disobedience in the summer of 1964. And indeed, Reverend John H. Adams declared that Seattle would be in for a long, hot summer. But I would suggest that the long, hot summer never came. Actually, long, hot summers never come to Seattle anyway. The intense public debate over open housing persuaded a small segment of white Seattle to begin to open its arms to African-American neighbors. Let me give you an example here. Felicita Schoenfeld, 1964. She writes a letter to a civil rights group, and she says, "We will welcome African Americans." And hers is just the opening salvo in a campaign that is going to continue throughout 1964 and 1965. Indeed, by 1965, a small but steady stream of African Americans will begin to leave the Central District and move into integrated housing throughout Seattle. Now, it's not much. Indeed, it's a movement that's almost imperceptible at that point. But it's the beginning of a change that eventually is going to take on momentous proportions. In 1965 and 1966, two organizations in the suburbs of Seattle come online to promote open housing. The Kirkland Fair Housing Organization and Operation Equality in Federal Way. They open up suburban housing to African Americans. But one of the most remarkable activists at this period, and the man who's probably forgotten by many of us now and who should not be, was Sidney Gerber. And I don't know how many of you know Sidney Gerber, but Sidney Gerber essentially took it on his own to create an organization, a company indeed, called Harmony Homes. And Harmony Homes essentially bought open land in the suburbs of Seattle and built houses expressly for people of color, houses that would be occupied expressly for people of color. Now, these were small steps, but they were steps that would sort of turn the tide in terms of the idea or the concept of open housing. By April of 1968, the Seattle City Council again revisited the question of open housing. It passed a second open housing ordinance, this one introduced by Sam Smith, who was newly elected to the City Council. And this council said there will be no discrimination based upon race in housing selection throughout the city of Seattle. Now, I would argue, I will be completely candid with you and say that part of the reason for the passage of this measure, and by the way, it passed unanimously, it passed the City Council unanimously. Part of the reason for this measure was no doubt the fact that Martin Luther King had been assassinated on April 4th, and many of the cities across the country were literally in flames at the moment that the City Council was debating this issue. And so there is a huge national backdrop to this. But I would also argue that by 1968, the City Council of Seattle recognized that a lot of housing had been opened up voluntarily, that a number of African Americans were beginning to move outside of the Central District. The extent of the transformation of white attitudes about open housing became apparent 1 month after the Seattle City Council had made its momentous decision. In the month of May, 30,000 King County residents, primarily white, non-Central District homeowners, signed open housing petitions. 30,000 white homeowners throughout King County signed open housing petitions. Folks, there was nothing like this happening anywhere else in the country in 1968 or 1969 or the early 1970s. Seattle and King County began a slow but steady process of residential integration. This is the growth of the integrated areas, Rainier Valley, obviously, but also certain other areas in the city of Seattle as well. I want to draw your attention, though, to the quote there and the author of that quote. Some of you may know him. Dean, where are you? Oh, the dean was an assistant professor at the time. I love this dean. Can I embarrass you? He was assistant professor at the time, and he spoke to the question of housing integration in Seattle in 1981. But he spoke to, and I'm not even sure that he was aware that in 1981, this was part of a much larger trend that was going on that would eventually look like this. This is the decline of residential segregation in Seattle between 1960 and the year 2000. Folks, that map, the map on the right, shows the spread of African-American households throughout King County. Now, yes, there is still significant concentration in the city of Seattle, but it's certainly no longer concentrated in the Central District itself. As a matter of fact, to give you an idea of the significance of this development, there were only 3 cities in the entire country where by the year 2000, more African-Americans lived outside of the central city, not the Central District, the central city or the major city than inside it. And those cities were Los Angeles, Washington, D.C., and Seattle. In other words, Seattle had become one of the most residentially integrated cities in the country by that time. And I would argue that much of that integration took place because of the efforts of blacks and whites and Asians in the city of Seattle in the 1960s. Yet even as I say that, even as we congratulate ourselves on the fact that we had achieved this milestone in terms of residential integration, we have to understand that this victory is tempered by the knowledge that a whole host of black folks remain trapped in poverty in the Central District. And indeed, many of them remain trapped in poverty in the Central District right to this day. If the open housing campaign was a surprising success, the campaign against de facto school segregation must be seen as a stunning failure. All of us in this room know the consequences of that failed effort, and we all know that that failed effort continued well into the 1970s, 1980s, and 1990s. I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, but I want to talk about the reasons for that failure. I think there are 3 major reasons. The first reason has to do with the fact that, and I'll just be candid with you, a huge number of whites, even whites who were, ironically, in many instances, racially liberal on other questions, oppose mandatory busing. And we'll try to explore this. We'll try to deal with this in depth in a few minutes. But there was a tremendous opposition to mandatory busing throughout the 1970s, 1980s, 1990s. And that opposition to mandatory busing meant that effective, well, completely effective desegregation wouldn't come until relatively late. But there was also, but the failure also came because the campaign for ending de facto segregation would ultimately split the African American community itself. Eventually, there would be blacks who would favor de facto, or excuse me, the end of de facto segregation, but there would be a growing number of blacks who would argue that it was far more important. It was far more important for African Americans to have quality schools within the Central District and within the black neighborhoods than for black kids to simply sit next to white kids. But I would also suggest that the failure came because both local and national civil rights leaders lost their way. And this is where I think it becomes a bit controversial. I know a lot of you are not going to agree with me on this. But when I say they lost their way, I mean that many, many people who embrace school desegregation and embrace busing as a tactic to bring about that school desegregation in order to improve, as they saw it, the quality of black life, failed to make the distinction between busing as a tactic and busing as ultimately a goal in itself. When that distinction was not made, there were a whole host of political mistakes that were going to be made that would follow from that, and those political mistakes would haunt the city for a very long time. The roots of this thinking about segregation and about the importance of busing can be found up here. This is Henry Louis Gates, and he's talking about how black people thought about the question of school segregation. We believed the school segregation was wrong. We had been taught this, we had seen this. Many of us had grown up in segregated schools in the South. We knew instinctively that segregated schools were wrong. That's not the issue. The problem is, how do you desegregate? The problem is, how do you bring about a desegregation or an integration of those schools that will bring about the best possible solution for African Americans and for the whites who are around them? Unfortunately, that was a dilemma that was never really resolved. In 1957, the Seattle School Board took its first census of enrollment by race, and it found out something that was at least startling to them at that moment. First, they found out that only 5% of the 5% of the 91,000 students in the district were black. But they also found out that 81% of all of the black students were attending schools in the Central District. In other words, segregated schools had emerged. Despite the laws preventing this, despite a history in which Seattle had said adamantly that it would not allow this kind of development, segregated schools had emerged in Seattle. Listen to the words of Walter Huntley. We know the consequences when Negroes are forced to go to school together in their pin-up sections of the city. They learn to hate. Huntley was speaking not just about Seattle, he was speaking about a racial history that extended all over the country, and he was applying that maxim to Seattle at that moment. Huntley and other civil rights activists swung into action. At the urging of the Seattle Civil Rights Committee, the Seattle School Board initiated, reluctantly, the Voluntary Racial Transfer Program, or the VRT, in 1963. That Voluntary Racial Transfer Program would send an estimated 1,400 of 7,000 black pupils out of the Central District into white schools, or predominantly white schools, throughout the city. They would do this, the board said, to end the racial isolation of black children in the public schools. The announcement came, ironically, on August 28, 1963, the day that Martin Luther King gave his famous "I Have a Dream" speech. The Seattle School District and the city of Seattle thus became the first major city in the country to voluntarily undertake a district-wide school desegregation plan. Let me repeat that. Seattle becomes the first city in the country to voluntarily desegregate its schools. Now, that's something to be, for which the city ought to be congratulated. But unfortunately, history shows that there are complexities even when people attempt to do well. Civil rights leaders declared that the voluntary desegregation program advanced by the city school board was not enough. That indeed, those civil rights leaders called for essentially the schools in the Central District to be closed and all of the African-American children to be bused throughout the city. It was a bold move. It was a move that was done without consultation with a lot of black parents, but it was a move that civil rights leaders believed, maybe naively, believed would somehow or another ensure that there would be quality education. As a result of this, the civil rights leaders decided to wage, if you will, a campaign to try to pressure the school board into action. There were marches, there were demonstrations, there were other kinds of protests, all of which through 1965 seemed ineffectual. In 1966, they came up with a new strategy, a boycott of the schools. In other words, tell the black kids not to go to school, and this would be a 1 to 2 day protest. Tell the black kids not to go to school to show the displeasure of the black community with the continued segregation. Indeed, that boycott would take place on March 31st and April 1st of 1966. The so-called freedom schools were created on those days, and during that time period, an estimated 55% of the overall black student enrollment in the public schools in Seattle participated in this boycott. And in some elementary schools, 80% of the black students participated in the boycott. And let me explain here. When I say boycott, I mean that they not only did not go to the public schools, they went to special schools that were set up in the Central District. For instance, 500 children ended up going to Reverend McKinney's Mount Zion Church, others went to Temple de Hirsch, others went to various other locations in the Central District. This was an amazing situation because essentially black kids are going to these schools, these freedom schools, and they are attending for the first time these schools with whites and sympathetic white students and sympathetic Asian students. The freedom schools were an amazing experiment. They were an attempt to bring kids together over or across the barrier of race. They were an attempt to say that the schools indeed can be integrated. I want to draw your attention to Emily Hansen. I don't know very much about Emily Hansen, but she was one of the people who participated, one of the young kids who participated in the boycott. And I want you to read her words here. They're very poignant words. These kids, along with their parents, along with the civil rights leaders, wanted change. They wanted an integrated education because they sincerely believed that integration was ultimately in the best interest of African Americans and all the people of Seattle. They wanted what was best for black children. Unfortunately, their position was not universally shared. Increasingly, a number of black parents in the school district were going to be influenced by other streams of thought, by other ideas about school segregation and school integration. Indeed, by 1967, we would see the rise of black power. By 1967, we would see the rise of black power, not just nationally, but also in Seattle. By 1967, the Nation of Islam would emerge as a powerful, influential force in the Central District. By 1967, there would be other black power groups that would emerge in the Central District. And they indeed would argue that integration is not in the best interest of black children. That black children sitting next to white children is not automatic. It's not a sign of automatic progress. They would argue that black children should be educated in black schools. They got a hearing. These black power advocates got a hearing in 1967 with the visit of none other than Stokely Carmichael. And I don't know if many of you remember Stokely Carmichael, but he became the symbol of black power in 1966 and 1967. Stokely Carmichael came to Garfield High in 1967, in April of 1967, after addressing an audience at the University of Washington. He rarely visited high schools, but this time he made an exception. When he came to Garfield, 4,000 people came out to hear him. Carmichael, of course, as you can see here, talked about the need for African Americans to challenge the integrationists. He said that the integrationists were slowly destroying the African American community. And then, of course, he said these words. Essentially, Carmichael called for an alternative view, and Carmichael wasn't alone here. Carmichael and others called for an alternative view to the question of integration in society. The political repercussions of Carmichael's visit surfaced the following August with a new organization in Seattle. The organization was called the Central Area Committee for Peace and Improvement. It was a black power organization, and it was an organization that was dedicated not to integration of the schools, but to control of the African American schools. The committee presented a list of demands to the school board, which included the introduction of Black, Asian, and Indian history into the curriculum of every school in the city, and the hiring of additional minority teachers and counselors, especially in the Central District. But this wasn't the end. Essentially, they continued to organize, and on March 6, 1968, there would be a confrontation between the integrationists and the black power advocates at the East Madison, or actually the Meredith Matthews YMCA. Imagine the scene. I want to give you a kind of a verbal picture of the scene. 400 people came to discuss whether or not Seattle, or at least black Seattle, would pursue segregated schools or integrated schools. And of course, the black power advocates didn't talk in terms of segregated schools. They talked in terms of schools in which black people would control the education, black people would control the curriculum. These people who came to Meredith Matthews represented a wide spectrum of ideology within the African American community. No longer were the integrationists essentially in control of the discussion. In fact, to get a little bit ahead of myself, the integrationists would be swept off the platform. Reverend Adams attempted to control the meeting. He lost control of the meeting, and he lost control of the meeting to two groups, the Nation of Islam and the newly formed Black Student Union at the University of Washington. These groups argued differently. These groups argued that integration wasn't the key to racial progress. The integrationists, according to one observer, were, quote, swept off the platform. And not surprisingly, soon afterwards, Reverend Adams resigned his position in Seattle, and he assumed pastoral duties at a Los Angeles church. Civil rights leaders saw the meeting as a capitulation to hysteria, in the words of Walter Huntley. Yet other activists, others who were not in the civil rights fold, saw this as an assertion of working class blacks in an area heretofore dominated by black professionals. Listen to the words of future school board member Alfred Cowles. Quote, "The professional black leaders said that integration is going to be painful, so accept the pain that goes with it. But working class blacks, according to Cowles, said, we've been suffering pain far too long. Let the other groups suffer some pain." In other words, there was growing anger in African-American Seattle about the fact that integration seemed to come only on the backs of African-American students. And let me provide some background on this. The problem, as far as these Black Power advocates were concerned, goes all the way back to the time that the civil rights advocates called for the closure of all the Central District schools. The assumption, the operating assumption, was that black kids should leave the Central District and go elsewhere. The operating assumption was that the education that they would receive outside of the Central District or in predominantly white schools would automatically be better. And a lot of these Black Power advocates began to challenge that notion. By 1970, the campaign for school desegregation had come in full circle. Blacks, whites, and Asians, I would argue, all wanted quality education for their children, but they could not agree on what is meant by quality education. They could not agree on how to achieve that quality education in Seattle at that time. Growing number of parents of all colors resisted court-ordered busing when there was the inkling of that coming down the road. And indeed, they called for, if you will, they increasingly called for, if you will, neighborhood control of their schools. The campaign against de facto school segregation now divided blacks and whites, but it also pitted blacks against blacks and whites against whites in a search for a practical solution to the isolation of Seattle's children. You know, I have to tell you that when I wrote this lecture, I was told that this